Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to southwest Alaska and a small island just nestled into Uganik Bay of Kodiak Island. Though the island is known for giant bears, those bears aren't only on Kodiak, but also on the neighboring islands. One of these is Sally Island, which only rises about 1,000 feet in elevation. It's a diminutive island, only measuring about 2 miles wide by just under 2 miles long. Sally Island is covered in very dense foliage, composed primarily of huge stands of alder, interrupted with meadows of grasses. There are no rivers on this small island, which means that brown bears on the island either have to search for fish off the shore or swim to the main island. This is easily done on the south end of the island as Sheep Island comes close to connecting all three islands. Deer are just about the only animals on the island that are not predators, and that is what brings a handful of hunters to shore each fall. The brown bears on the island are directly related to the giant brown bears on Kodiak, so their temperament and power are well known. Now, a pack of bears is known as a sleuth or a mall, but bears aren't known to run in packs. There are a few exceptions to this rule, and one of them is when they are siblings or juveniles. Some call a pack of bears a sleuth because of the way bears search through the forest, as if they're detectives looking for facts. A pack of sibling bears is called a litter, but as they grow, this reference to them loses its applicability due to their age. When the cubs reach around 2 years of age, the sow will frequently run them off so she can more easily fend for herself. But if the cubs contribute to her survival, then she will tend to hunt with them. When the litter becomes a sleuth, and their mother manages to keep the litter together and raise them into juvenile bears, they can remain with her as a dangerous and efficient killing team. When a sow has a litter of cubs, the litter is usually between 1 and 3 in number. Cubs have a 34% mortality rate in Alaska and frequently spend at least 2 years with their mother. This means that only 2 cubs in a litter of 3 will survive to venture out on their own. The survival of the cubs depends on a few factors, including the availability of food sources and the willingness of the sow to defend them. If she can offer a violent defense of her cubs from boars, then her cubs will stand a good chance of reaching independence and success. On Thursday, October 30th, 2014, 68-year-old Michael Snowden and his 38-year-old hunting partner Jeff Ostrin arrived at their hunting camp. Each year, the men would hunt together for a week on Sally Island and frequently filled their tags, refreshed their friendship, and filled their freezers for the winter. Snowden was a native of Alaska from Sitka, and Ostrin moved up from Camas, Washington. The men were hunting with the help of a guide and a party of about 10 deer hunters. They used a boat dubbed the Mary J. to deposit the hunters on various locations on the island to hunt for the day. At the end of the hunting day, the hunters would all reboard the boat to return to camp for the night. The first 6 days of their deer hunting went very well, with fun and surrounded by beautiful scenery. On November 4th, 2014, the men's hunt was going just as planned. They'd climbed the steep slopes of the island after coming ashore in the early morning. Pushing their way through brush and glassing breaks in the alders for bucks to emerge made the day slip by in a relaxing manner. At around 10 a.m., Ostrin observed a buck at the top of the island and stalked within shooting range. A single well-placed shot from his hunting rifle brought the buck down and filled one of their tags. As the buck disappeared below the brush, Snowden and Ostrin walked toward the spot where they last saw the buck. Upon arriving at the buck's location, they immediately started to process the deer for recovery by removing its entrails, or gutting it as hunters refer to it. While one man removed the entrails of the deer, the other would stand guard, watching for brown bears. Some bears tend to head to a location after hearing the report of a hunting rifle. These bears are called dinner bill bears, with a shot being the equivalent of calling them in for dinner. The hunters knew that time was key to avoid a confrontation with a hungry bear, and after gutting the deer, began dragging it toward the island's southeastern shore. The Mary J. was drifting just off the shore, and they would radio for it to pick them up when they were ready. As Ostrin and Snowden dragged their buck through the thick brush, a steady seep of blood and bodily fluids leaked out behind them in a tempting trail. This scent was easily detectable by any bears on the island in the right conditions, and would lead to a dangerous situation. With only about a mile left before they reached the shore, the hunters decided to sit down and eat their sandwiches for lunch. They removed their packs and walked about 20 feet farther downhill to sit down. No sooner had they taken the first few bites of their meals than they began to hear some rustling in the brush only a few yards from them. Given their location, the hunters knew this could be a harbinger of something very bad. They grabbed their rifles and chambered rounds in each one. Just as they closed their actions on their hunting rifles, a 700-pound brown bear burst from the brush in their direction. Down in the bay, the Mary J. was adrift when the hunters on the island came into view in the meadow. The handful of hunters aboard could see Snowden and Ostrin sit down and start eating. To their concern, they also saw 5 brown bears emerge just above the hunters. The bears appeared to be a sow, with her 4 very large 3-year-old cubs. The hunters could see the bears lift their noses to sample the air, and then drop their noses to the blood trail of the deer's carcass in the grass. They were interested in whatever was on the breeze, wafting from Snowden and Ostrin's direction. The scent of deer blood and guts, likely mixed in with that of the hunters' lunch, and the hunters themselves, combined in an alluring aroma to the bears. The hunters aboard the Mary J. immediately radioed Ostrin and Snowden, but they received no answer. Unbeknownst to the boat, they had turned off their radio while they were packing the deer out and planned to turn it back on to contact the vessel after reaching the shore. The hunters decided to try to signal Snowden and Ostrin by firing their hunting rifles into the air as a warning. It was deer season, and the report of deer hunting rifles wasn't out of the ordinary. Snowden and Ostrin passed off the rifle shots as nearby deer hunters pursuing their quarry. It was then that the hunters aboard the Mary J. noticed that the sow had finally caught the scent she was searching for on the breeze. Once she figured out where the scent was coming from, she dashed directly toward the source with amazing speed. When the hunters on the Mary J. witnessed the sow running toward Snowden and Ostrin, they knew they had to do something to help. The boat was pointed ashore, and they began scrambling up the steep slope toward the deer carcass. Back at the deer carcass, as soon as the bushes began to rustle and the men chambered rounds in their hunting rifles, the angry sow had busted from the brush. Snowden fired off a hip shot as a warning to her, but it missed striking the bear. Before he could do much else, the sow had tackled him to the ground, biting and scratching his body wherever she could reach. Between Snowden twisting and kicking, and the sow's jaws snapping and her claws slashing, the sow had ended up with a vice-like grip on his hamstring. He could feel her teeth punch through the outermost layer of tissues, then click together. She violently shook her massive head back and forth, tossing Snowden around along with it. As the sow jerked him back and forth, Snowden lost his grip on his hunting rifle. He desperately tried to flick the leather strap securing his revolver to its holster on his chest, but due to the jostling, was unable to loosen it. She pulled him down the slope a few yards during the furious attack before the 1.5-pound chunk of the man's flesh tore loose. As Ostrin watched his friend being mauled by the sow, he tried to find a way to shoot her without injuring Snowden. He decided a rump shot would distract the bear and fired into her rear end, hoping to break her hips and immobilize her. The bear didn't release Snowden, so Ostrin chambered another round and fired into the bear's ribs. The sow and Snowden began tumbling down the hill for a short distance after Ostrin's second bullet struck her. During this tumble, they separated from each other a few yards, allowing Ostrin to fire a third shot, killing the sow. By now the bear and both of the men were a few yards down the hill from where the attack had started. Ostrin briefly checked on Snowden before climbing up the hill to retrieve their backpacks and radio. As Ostrin radioed the Mary J., a second bear appeared from the brush, from near where the sow had emerged. Now, having had more than enough action for the day, Ostrin pulled his pistol from its holster and dispatched this bear with a single shot. It was slightly smaller in size than the sow, and he realized it was likely her cub. Upon hearing the shots and now unable to find their mother, the other 3 juvenile bears fled the area. By now the Mary J. had made land, and the handful of hunters had scrambled a fair portion up the hill toward the men. As they arrived at the attack site, they began to gather the men's backpacks and other gear, as well as render first aid to Snowden's separated hamstring wound. As they examined the injuries, they could see a piece of skin and muscle about 8 by 11 inches had ripped loose and flopped around, being attached at only one end. Beneath this slab of tissue, they could see an enormous hole in Snowden's hamstring. The Mary J.'s captain used the boat's radio to reach out to the U.S. Coast Guard. They dispatched a Sikorsky HH-60 Jayhawk to Sally Island. As they waited for the helicopter, the hunters tried to keep Snowden awake and from falling into shock. They put pressure on his wound and tried to keep him comfortable as best they could. Once the Coast Guard helicopter arrived on the scene, they deployed a tethered litter to the ground with a rescue expert. They loaded Snowden into the litter, and he was pulled aboard the copter before they headed for Providence Kodiak Island Medical Center. Ostrin was flown back to Kodiak in a small chartered plane. Once he was admitted to the hospital, Snowden's wounds were cleaned, and he received 100 staples to reattach his flesh to his hamstring. By Thursday of the same week, he was hobbling around the hospital without a cane. Both men expressed gratitude to medical staff, fellow hunters, and the Mary J's crew for their handling of the attack, treatment, and rescue. The Alaska Fish and Game issued a public statement reminding hunters to remove meat from the carcass of their game and place it in sealed containers instead of packing out the entire carcass. Leaving the bones in a fall could provide a distraction for bears converging on the carcass. Snowden says the big takeaway from this experience for him is how quickly the bears picked up on the scent of the blood of the deer. He encourages hunters not to underestimate how sensitive bears' noses can be. Alaska is home to 98% of the brown bears in the United States, which puts the attacks reported in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming into perspective. If there were the same density of people in Alaska as there are along the Great Divide, would there be the same frequency of attacks? After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Does the fact that this sow successfully raised 4 cubs and kept them with her as juveniles indicate that she was a good defender of them? Do you think the bears would have been distracted by the carcass had the men removed only the meat from it? Would the hunters have made it safely to the shore if they hadn't stopped to eat, or would the bears have caught them before that? What do you think would have happened had the hunters dropped into a fetal position and just waited for the bears to leave? Tell me what would go through your mind if you were covered in deer blood and guts as you watched 5 brown bears emerge from the brush only a few yards from you. I will gladly read and respond to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Japanese island of Hokkaido. On the southern part of the island is Mount Daisingen. It is only around 3,500 feet high, and is the location of our episode today. This mountainous area is shaded by forests of Sakhalin fir, Sakhalin spruce, Japanese oak, birch, and painted maple trees. The island of Hokkaido is home to several unique species found nowhere else on Earth. Cicadee and wild boar are common here, but the giant salamander, Ezo flying squirrel, tanuki, and the amami rabbit are Hokkaido exclusives. The predators here include the Ezo red fox, tanuki, weasels, and brown bears. An alarming trend has been developing on the island over the last few years, which has reached its climax. Government policy on bear management has been successful in increasing bear numbers. Habitat recovery is also progressing as people leave rural areas for more lucrative jobs in the cities. This leaves the agricultural buffer around cities vacant of humans and their activities. Without regular contact with people, brown bears here have become emboldened and have started to attack people like they've never before. On October 29, 2022, 22-year-old college student Kanado Yanaki was driving to Mount Daisingen for a hike. He was a fourth-year student at Hokkaido University in Fukushima and was studying fisheries management. Kanado enjoyed hiking and mountain climbing. He was intelligent and adventurous, loving anything outside. Kanado loaded his gear and boarded his vehicle for the 45-minute drive to the parking lot at the trailhead on Mount Daisingen. The winding road rises from the coastal highway at sea level to just below the peak at 3,500 feet high. Each bend in the road represented an ever-improving view of the forest eventually giving way to the ocean. Upon arriving at the trailhead, Kanado parked his car and headed up the trail toward the peak, but he was not seen again after leaving his home. Earlier in the summer of 2022, 54-year-old fisherman Toshihiro Nishikawa was fishing for Sakhalin taimen in Lake Shimoronai in the northern part of the island. Taimen are similar to North American steelhead, but are much larger. They can reach 6 feet in length and weigh 100 pounds. They're trophy fish valued around the world. Nishikawa was dropped off to fish alone by a fishing guide he had contracted to help him on his fishing trip. As the fishing guide piloted his boat away, he observed a brown bear near the location. He reached out to Nishikawa by way of radio, but was unsuccessful in contacting him. Deciding the bear likely wouldn't be a problem, he piloted his boat out of the area to leave Nishikawa in peace to fish. A few hours later, the fishing guide returned to pick up Nishikawa, but couldn't raise him on the radio. Searchers were sent to the lake and found his severed head submerged in the water. A short distance away, a brown bear was observed chewing on his waders. A search for his body was unsuccessful. Local police organized a bear hunt and killed a brown bear, but weren't sure if it was the bear that killed Nishikawa. Authorities issued public warnings to citizens who were planning on venturing into the forests. On October 31, 2022, just a few days after Kanado disappeared, 3 firefighters were out for a hike on Mount Deisingen. They climbed about halfway up the mountain when they decided to sit down and rest. While they were resting, a brown bear emerged from the brush and began attacking the men. The bear first knocked one of the firefighters down and began to bite him furiously. When one of his friends tried to intervene, the bear immediately pounced on the second firefighter, biting and clawing him as well. As it menaced the rest of the men, one of the firefighters pulled out a knife he'd been packing. The bear began to close in on him, and he slashed at the bear, striking it in the neck. His swipe with his knife severed a major artery and sent the bear fleeing while spraying blood from the neck wound. The firefighters made their way back down the mountain and reported the aggressive brown bear to authorities. This brazen attack by the brown bear sparked an intensive search for its body. They weren't positive it had died, but based on its reported injuries, thought it may have succumbed to them. As searchers climbed Mount Deisingen slopes, they found a dead brown bear. It was about the same size as the bear that attacked the firemen, but didn't have a knife wound in its neck. They found a second bear of a much smaller size nearby, also dead. After canvassing the area, they stumbled upon Kanado's body. The 22-year-old had been savaged by a brown bear and partially eaten. The bear had cached his body under dirt and sticks to be consumed later. Forensic crews gathered Kanado's corpse and the carcasses of the 2 bears. They also took evidence from the attack site for analysis. Kanado's cause of death was declared to be due to blood loss from the hundreds of wounds inflicted by the brown bear. His death was not fast and may have taken hours before his passing. The scientists examined the larger bear and found it to have no major injuries. They were most interested in finding a knife wound in its neck, but when they searched its carcass, they couldn't find one. The contents of its stomach were examined, and it was determined to have consumed Kanado's flesh. The smaller bear was not found to have ingested flesh from Kanado's corpse, but its cause of death was not listed in any source I could find. With all the evidence and analysis, authorities had some difficulty in making sense of it all. Was the larger bear the same bear that had attacked the firefighters and had killed and eaten Kanado? Or had that bear and its cub been killed by a larger bear that had ambushed the firefighters after killing and eating Kanado? After putting the puzzle together, the most likely scenario emerged. The larger bear must have attacked and killed Kanado, afterward caching his body for food. Then the sow and her cub came to feed off Kanado's remains. It must have killed the sow and cub in defense of Kanado's corpse as its food cache. It was most likely the same bear that had ambushed the firefighters and had likely died elsewhere after suffering the grievous knife wound to its neck. Searchers never found the carcass of the big bear with the knife wound to his neck, but it is assumed that the wound ultimately led to his death. Since April 2022, 160 injuries and 3 human deaths have occurred in Hokkaido. Kanado's death was the first human fatality to bear attack in over a decade in all of Japan. This rapid increase in attacks is attributed to a dwindling food supply and human populations fleeing agricultural areas around cities. Authorities in Japan have become so desperate to stop bear attacks that they have turned to technology for a solution. They've started using monster wolves. These huge robot wolves have glowing red eyes and sound a howl that reaches 90 decibels. Monster wolves are stationed near known bear traffic areas. They view the monster wolves as a form of scarecrow to frighten the bears away. There are an estimated 6,500 to 10,000 brown bears on the island of Hokkaido alone. These bears are unique as they are darker in color than other brown bears and have a longer skull and lower slope in their forehead. They can stand 7.5 feet in height and weigh up to 1,100 pounds. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think the agricultural areas now being vacated are bringing brown bears closer to cities on Hokkaido? What is emboldening brown bears to attack humans in Japan? Is the lack of management of brown bear numbers leading to overpopulation and increasing attacks on humans? Do you think robot wolves are a great idea to deter bears? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the farmlands of Karnataka State in central India. To the southwest of the city is a rugged and isolated patch of forest mountains. The Thimlapura forest covers these mountains, which stretch northeast right into the town of Madagiri. The granite domes and peaks in the mountain range rise to around 2,500 feet in elevation and create a sloped jungle where many species of animals live. Denizens that live here include wild boar, Indian elephants, gaur, sambar, and barking deer. Predators in this area include Bengal tigers, Indian leopards, wolves, dholes, which are an ancient wild dog, and sloth bears. These animals find shelter in forests of mixed evergreens and semi-evergreen trees like Borneo mahogany, false hemp trees, and Malabar tamarind trees. In the Thimlapura Wild Conservancy, sloth bears embrace one of their few remaining sanctuaries. They can live up to 40 years old, which makes them the longest living member of the bear family. Usually standing between 5 and 6 feet in height and weighing from 120 to 310 pounds, they are more diminutive than other bear species. The bears subsist on fruit, termites, and honey, and rarely attack human beings. Their canine teeth and claws are proportionately the largest of the bear family. At about 11 a.m. on the morning of November 20th, 2014, 45-year-old farmer Samana was planning on hiking into the more remote part of his property to harvest aloe vera. After exiting his home, he picked up his machete and walked along the sloping trail to the wooded area. As he searched the ground for the pointed leaves of the aloe vera plants, he wandered the brush and navigated the trails. The brush was thick and hid many possible dangers. Cobras are common here, and many other deadly snakes inhabit the area as well. As he hacked a few plants, he would put them in a bag held on his waist. At times he had to push brush out of the way and push his way through bushes. This kept his focus off of his surroundings and allowed him to find himself in dangerous proximity to a sloth bear. Samana rounded a large bush and stood face to face with a sloth bear. He thought he was making enough noise to let any animal near him know of his presence. The bear stared blankly at the man from only a few feet, but the bear nor the man moved for a few seconds. Samana's mind raced with what he should do. He knew that sloth bears were extremely violent and dangerous, but hoped it would dash off into the forest. As his adrenaline peaked, Samana decided to protect himself, as opposed to run. He struck out with the machete and slashed the bear in a defensive attack bent on saving himself. After absorbing the first few strikes from the man's machete, the sloth bear dealt a few strikes of his own. It wrapped its paws around the man's legs and tackled him to the ground. Now atop Samana, the bear began biting into his cheeks while it jabbed its long claws into the flesh of his face. It raked its claws back as if it were tearing apart a termite mound. Instead of termites being scattered, Samana's flesh was tattered into bleeding strings that dangled from his face. Samana screamed for help, and his cries soon reached the ears of passers-by. A small crowd began to gather, then grew to a larger crowd. They immediately phoned the police and returned to the attack site to try to help Samana. The bear's attack never relented over 4 hours, while police waited for permission to kill the bear. The crowd watched as it dug its huge canines into the man's eye sockets and ripped bone and flesh from his face. Over the course of the attack, Samana began to move slower and resist the bear's violence with less effectiveness. He was losing blood very quickly and tissue even faster. The crowd began to throw rocks and yell at the bear, trying to get it to back off and stop tearing the man apart. As the crowd watched, the sloth bear began to chew off the flesh of Samana's right thigh. They continually pelted the bear with rocks and yelled, but it could not be deterred. After continuing its attack, it suddenly switched its focus to the angry mob. It stormed toward the crowd as they fled in panic. As he ran, 55-year-old manual laborer Thamaya stumbled just as the bear approached him. The bear didn't miss a beat and pounced on the man, attacking his face. A video of this attack is provided in my Patreon account, which is linked below. I will warn you that it is one of the most disturbing videos I've ever seen, so watch it at your discretion. The sloth bear utilized the same technique to tear Thamaya's face apart as it had with Samana's. It jabbed its claws deep into the flesh of his face and ripped it apart. The bear was observed cracking the bones of the man's forehead and cheeks during the violent and bloody attack. Police who were on the scene could do little to frighten the bear away. They fired 5 warning shots into the air, hoping to drive the bear off. After watching the attack on Thamaya, they finally fired a fatal shot into the bear, which brought the attack to an end. Once the bear fell over dead, the crowd grabbed Samana's corpse and the injured Thamaya and dragged them to the hospital. The bear's carcass was examined, and it was noted to be 12 years old and was likely starving. By the time the bear was killed, it had consumed all of the flesh of Samana's right thigh and a significant portion of his left thigh as well. Thamaya was rushed to Victoria Hospital in Bengaluru, where he was treated for multiple lacerations and bite wounds to his face, body, and arms. He did survive the attack, but his face will be deformed for the rest of his life. Sloth bear attacks are not common in India. Usually the bears disappear into the forest after they attack people, but this bear refused to leave. Also unusual was the fact that it consumed a large portion of its victim. It is believed that the refuge extending so far into the city was what allowed the bear to wander into the farm. On the refuge, the bear would rarely see people, and likely never had a close encounter with one. In the Tumakuru district, authorities say there is an average of 5 sloth bear attacks each year, with most of those ending in severe damage to the victim's face. Many survive, but a few attacks are serious enough to cost the victims their lives. Samana's attack was the first sloth bear attack in which the bear ate its victim. Sloth bears cling to an existence across India and Southeast Asia. Only 8,000 to 10,000 sloth bears remain, spread across their habitat. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do sloth bears see humans as competition for prime habitat or resources? Should sloth bears be saved through land use reforms? Why are sloth bears so overpowered with giant canines and claws? I will be glad to read and reply to your thoughts, so please post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.